Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. We're going to begin this part of our semester working again with our friends from the Special Collections Department of the Smathers Library at UF. And we're lucky we hear from these folks every year or year and a half. They put something together. The last time they were here, they were covering things that there were part of the collections. They're as curators, they all have responsibility for certain collections that the library have. Now this semester, we're going to hear about some of their own personal research, because these are they're curators, but they're scholars in their own right. And the last time we were here, Rebecca Jefferson, who's going to be our speaker today, was speaking about cookbooks and the relationship between cookbooks and culture. But while she was speaking for us, she mentioned several times the Cairo Geniza. And that was an intriguing subject, and she's going to bring that to us again. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Boyd Murphy. Boyd is the coordinator in Special Collections for bringing our speakers here and getting the program organized. And he's going to give a little more formal introduction for Rebecca. So welcome, Boyd.
Thank you, Ron. Appreciate it. As Ron said, I'm Boyd Murphy from Special and Area Studies Collections. I work with a lot of our political collections, and I'll be talking later in our classes here about David Levy-Yulee and Senator Westcott, our first two senators from Florida. Just to let me introduce Rebecca now. Rebecca J.W. Jefferson is the curator of the Isser and Ray Price Library of Judaica at the University of Florida and a joint faculty member of the Center for Jewish Studies. Prior to moving to Florida, she gained her PhD in medieval Hebrew from the University of Cambridge in 2004 and worked as a research associate in Cambridge University Library. In addition to managing and developing the Price Library, Rebecca recently completed a National Endowment for the Humanities Challenge grant, raising $2 million endowment in support of preserving, collecting, and promoting Jewish heritage materials from Florida, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Yes, that's certainly well deserved. Her personal research focuses on the history of Judaica libraries and collections, and she has published numerous articles on the discovery of the Cairo Geniza. Her book on the subject, The Cairo Geniza and the Age of Discovery in Egypt, The History and Provenance of a Jewish Archive, was published last year by Bloomsbury. Which, as we can see, this is the topic of her talk today, Finding Pieces of the Puzzle, The Curious Case of the Cairo Geniza. Rebecca?
Hello and welcome. I'm going to put my telephone timer on because I don't want to go over time. Can you all hear me okay? Good. All right, starting. So when I was asked to talk on my own personal research topic, the Cairo Geniza, I was extremely excited to do this because I don't get to do this very often. But then I've getting very nervous because when people ask me, what do you research? And I say, the Cairo Geniza, they say, the what now? and it's a very complicated thing to explain. So I was a little bit nervous putting this together because I hope that I'm going to be able to convey to you what the Cairo Geniza is and why it's important. So let's give this a shot. I need to put my glasses on. Okay. So for today's class, oh, no, I've got mine up, but you haven't got yours up. There we go. No, you're fine. We're going to learn, start off by telling you what the scholarly context was, the backdrop of this thing called the Cairo-Geniza. And we'll talk about the transmission of ancient biblical texts and the paucity of early textual evidence for biblical scholarship in the 19th century. We'll see what a Geniza is and the Jewish practice of Geniza, whatever that is. And then to the Cairo Geniza, whatever that is, what it was, and how it was discovered. And then something about the importance of the Cairo Geniza for scholarship, where these Geniza collections, because we're talking about a massive manuscript collection, where it's located today, and how scholars are finding and matching the pieces of this vast, vast manuscript puzzle. And then some of the additional puzzles that this collection presents that is the subject of my research. So the scholarly context is really, we're in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, we have the rise and development of several interconnected disciplines. The rise of Egyptology, which goes back a couple of centuries to the Napoleonic era and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the work of Champollion to decipher the Rosetta Stone. And this whole new interest in Egypt kicks off the discipline of Egyptology. Archaeology is a new and rising field in the 19th century. The discipline is being developed by people in the field such as Flinders Petrie of London. Philological studies and Oriental studies all getting developed thanks to discoveries being made of ancient texts from the Near East and the Far East. And that is enabling scholars to get to know better languages and the history of language, the history and development of languages, particularly Near Eastern language and Far Eastern languages. And then two that are very connected are biblical studies and Jewish studies. Jewish studies was born in the 19th century. It was born thanks to Jewish scholars being allowed into academic institutions and thinking to themselves, well, really, Jewish history and culture deserves to be treated in the same scientific way as any other culture's history. And so there were the birth of studies in Jewish languages, and because Jews have lived all over the world. And then also the rise of something called higher biblical criticism. And alongside those disciplines, we get things developing alongside them that sort of come about as a result of them, but also the disciplines, they're interconnected, they rely on one another. So for example, the rise in antiquities market, dealers and collectors looking for precious objects, precious texts, and they know that now they have interested people willing to buy them. And those people are the scholars in these disciplines, but they're also the rising museums and libraries. And there's a huge rise in tourism as well. A lot of manuscript hunters and people wanting to travel to parts of the Near East and Far East, opened up by the development of the railroad. So a lot of things going on in the 19th century. Very, very fascinating and important period. The two that we're interested in for this talk are biblical studies and Jewish studies. And these both develop in Germany in around the mid-19th century. And one of the German Protestant scholars developed this scholarly interest in, and they call it higher biblical criticism. And thanks, as I said, to discovering many ancient texts, what they were trying to do was to find independent confirmation of the events. Oh, you know what? I've been talking to you and not showing you the slides. That's a problem with having my there's a problem with having my laptop in front of me. I'm sorry. So here we go. You can see in the blue, you can see those disciplines. that are rising in the 19th century, and in the orange, the things that are interconnected with those rising disciplines. And then the two that I said, higher biblical criticism and Jewish studies. And they're both interested in the history and development of the Hebrew Bible. Now, the German scholars of higher biblical criticism in the 19th century, they're looking for independent confirmation of the historical events mentioned in the Bible. And what they come up with a whole theory that there were numerous editors of the Hebrew Bible, that Moses, the Bible wasn't handed to us by Moses, it was actually written by many editors. And as they're doing this, they're also trying to separate the Jews of that day, of modern day, from the Israelites of the Old Testament. So unfortunately, there's something of an element of anti-Semitism to their work. And this is the period in which anti-Semitism is on the rise in Germany in the late 19th century. Now, Jewish scholars, on the other hand, in Jewish studies, they're trying to look at the same, they're interested in the same things, and they're conducting linguistic analyses of the Hebrew Bible. They're interested in trying to trace the actual historical events mentioned in it. But they're also very interested in using other major Jewish works to complement their studies. Major Jewish works such as the Mishnah, the Oral Law, and the Talmud. These are texts that the German scholars are ignoring. Both scholars in both disciplines are looking for early textual evidence for their research. So at the time, you might be surprised to hear this. We have the Bible, we have the Hebrew Bible. For Jewish people, it's the Hebrew Bible. For Christians, it's the Old Testament. And you might be surprised, we have this text. What were the oldest copies known in the 19th century? Well, the oldest Torah scroll was actually from the 13th century. There were no older Torah scrolls known at that time. And this was hiding in a Dominican friary in Bologna. And there were European scholars who got to see it and visit it, but that was really all that was known of it. And as for copies of the Hebrew Bible, the oldest in existence was this one there. You can see the Aleppo Codex. That was from the 10th century. It was a complete copy of the Hebrew Bible, and it was the earliest known. But that one was kind of a little bit more hidden away. It was held in a synagogue in Syria, in Aleppo. And scholars could get to it, but it was a much harder job to convince the synagogue officials to let people see it. It was called the Crown. It was known as the Crown, and access was very, very difficult. So those were the oldest versions of the Bible known to these scholars. But what we do know about the Hebrew Bible is that it was meticulously copied from century to century. And why do we know that? We know that because in Jewish law, there are strict laws regarding the copying of the Bible. And so you have everything has to be prepared in a certain way. The dimensions have to be a particular way. The height of the columns, all the units have to look the same. Every scribal mark has to look the same. There's a whole procedure. Now, it usually takes a scribe about a year to write a Torah scroll, as I say, because it's such difficult and meticulous work, and they have to have very in-depth training to do it. But if something goes wrong in that process, and any of the copying is incorrect, then the scroll cannot be used for liturgical purposes. It's now a non-sacred object. So there's something that you need to do with this scroll once it's no longer fit for liturgical purpose. You have to put it in a place called a geniza, and it's pronounced geniza. It comes from a Persian word, and it's first found in the book of Esther in the Bible, where they refer to this geniza as a treasury where you hide your treasures. And then it develops the Hebrew root of the word means hiding or storage. And over time, it became used as a noun to talk about the place that you would hide or store your old Torah scrolls, scrolls that had been worn out through a lot of use, or scrolls that had some sort of error on them and so unfit for liturgical use. And so every Jewish synagogue had either a cupboard or a little room to put these worn out objects. And then over time, once the cupboard got full, you'd take them all out and you'd take them for a proper burial. The Torah scroll is such a sacred object that it's treated very much in the same way as Jewish law and practice treats the human body, very much given that same dignity. So often, Torah scrolls would be buried alongside scholars. Um, so that's the Jewish practice of Geniza. But scholars have since found that actually Jewish communities around the world have varying practices of Geniza, and some of them they put them in the synagogue cupboard. Some of them take them out directly to the cemetery. Some of them bury them around the synagogue. Lots of different practices, and one of the most famous Genizas is, you may well have heard of this collection, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were some very ancient Torah scrolls and other biblical writings discovered in Qumran near the Dead Sea in these caves. Oh, and I'm doing it again. I'm so sorry. Geniza. All right. This is a depiction of a Geniza created by the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv. And you can see the synagogue officials putting away sacred books and Torah scrolls inside a Geniza. And there we are, the cave at Qumran. I mustn't. This was discovered in 1947. Now, I gave you a handout. I don't know whether you can see it, but there's a table on one of the pages. It was just to give you, again, that sense of what was known in the 19th century with regard to ancient Jewish texts. And really, with regard to the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible, we really only had Codex Vaticanus, which was kept in the Vatican. That was the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that was the oldest thing. It was a 4th century codex. And as I said, the Aleppo Codex. Everything else, as you can see on the table, was discovered in the 19th century. And then if you turn it over, and all of those in the 19th century were all manuscripts really from the Middle Ages. It's really only in the 20th century that the really ancient materials were discovered. So we don't get a copy of a Torah scroll, an ancient Torah scroll, until 1947 with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then going back even further in time, one of the most magnificent discovery was the Ketef Chinon scrolls. These were amulets on silver, and those were 6th century BCE. But they weren't discovered until 1979. So I hope you get a sense of what scholars were battling with. You know, they're trying to investigate the history of the Bible and the events described in it. They're trying to establish the development of the language that's in the Bible, and yet they don't have a lot to work with. And so this is why these discoveries were extremely important. And scholars, the Dead Sea Scrolls were kept within jars, and they were hidden in these caves. And they were written by a community living in this area, a Jewish sect living in this area. And what they think that this is a kind of a geniza, that they hid away their Jewish texts in jars in order to preserve them. And luckily, thanks to the very dry climate and the coolness of the cave, they were preserved for that length of time. Make sure to move on. Okay. So we're back in the 19th century and we're looking for this textual evidence. And we know it's out there. There must be some. We know that there was the Rosetta Stone was discovered, which was this amazing stone that gave us the Egyptian hieroglyphs and the Demotic and the Coptic, and enabled us to break through that hieroglyphic language and discover the mysteries of that hieroglyphic language. So we know that there are things to be discovered, and there are people determined to discover them. And one of the ones I wanted to show you is this gentleman here called Reverend Henry Lancel. He was a British explorer, um, and he explored a lot in Russia and China. He went to places that not many people had been until that time. And he came back with this wonderful armor and saddlecloth when he met with the Emir of Bukhara. But he knew that there were Jewish communities, ancient Jewish communities in places like Bukhara, and he was convinced that they must hold treasures. And so he asked the advice of the curator of the Hebrew collection in Russia, what should I be looking for? And he told him, well, don't look for rolls of the Pentateuch, don't look for Torah scrolls. And the reason they weren't looking for Torah scrolls is they thought, well, there's no point in finding Torah scrolls because they're the same. They've never changed. We have these strict rules about how we copy them. Therefore, if we've got a Torah scroll from the Middle Ages or a Torah scroll from the 1600s, it's the same thing as it ever was. So don't bother looking for Torah scrolls. Don't bother looking at scrolls of Esther. They're exactly the same. But if you can find manuscripts in book form, do check for those. And the larger the characters and the smaller the number of columns, then you're going to be finding something very important and ancient. So that's what he was looking for. And so he went to visit this, he had a letter of introduction to the Jewish community in Bukhara. And indeed, in their synagogue, in their Geniza, which was actually up there, I don't know whether you can see the stairs up there hidden, where he wrote about this in a book. He said hundreds of Torah scrolls, hundreds, but he ignored them. When he got back to England a few years later, he heard that somebody else had been over there and brought back some very important Torah scrolls, indeed, Torah scrolls from the Middle Ages, and that he was rather foolish in ignoring them. A more successful manuscript hunter was this man here. His name was Abraham Furkovich, and he was a Karaite. Now, Karaites were a sect of Judaism. The Karaites were established in the 8th century CE, and they adhered strictly to the Bible, and they didn't follow rabbinic Judaism. They rejected rabbinic Judaism. So they weren't interested in the Mishnah, they weren't interested in the Talmud, they were only interested purely in the Hebrew Bible. So he was a Karaite living in Russia, a Russian Karaite, and he was determined to prove that his people were more ancient than the 8th century. So to do that, he went on a first trip around Russia and the Crimea, and he discovered many manuscripts in Genizas. The plural is Genizot. The other people hadn't bothered to look in them because people believed that if you put away a sacred book in a Geniza, it would eventually rot. You know, if you hadn't already taken it out to the cemetery and buried, then it would eventually rot. So there wouldn't be anything there anyway worth finding. But he thought differently, and he was very wise in thinking differently because he found some magnificent things. For example, he found this here, which is now known as the Leningrad Codex. And it's the most complete version of the Hebrew Bible, earliest complete version of the Hebrew Bible. It's from 1008 CE. Now, I showed you the Aleppo Codex, and that is older for sure. That's from the 900s. But the problem with the Aleppo Codex is when during after the declaration of the independence of the state of Israel, when Syria declared war on Israel, there were riots against the Jews of Syria, and their synagogue was burnt down. Well, someone rescued the Aleppo Codex, but it got over to Israel. It's in Israel now, but it's now missing many of its pages. That's a whole interesting story in itself. You want to read about it, there's a book on the Aleppo Codex. So today, the oldest Hebrew Bible complete Hebrew Bible in existence is this one here that he found, the Leningrad Codex. And he found many, many other important Hebrew works from the Middle Ages hidden in these Genizas in the Crimea, because the Jews of the Crimea were a fairly old and established community, and they had brought them over with them when they moved to the Crimea from the Middle East. He had some rather his tactics weren't terribly good in acquiring these wonderful treasures. He would do things like promise the Jewish community to give them funds to restore their synagogues if they allowed him to take away from their Genizas, things like that. Other times, he would just bring in the Russian authorities with him and demand access. One of the synagogue attics that he went into, he demanded access, and he had to build all these ladders to get into it. Once he got inside, it was apparently filled to the rafters with ancient books. He didn't take all of them with him, and sadly, whatever else was there disappeared over time. But after he did all of his hunting in Russia and the Crimea, he then went over on a second trip to the Middle East. Now, he was a very long-lived man, and he actually went there in his 80s. So if you're looking for something to do in retirement, maybe maybe manuscript hunting is for you, because he had a fantastic time. He went and he was situated. His base was in Jerusalem, and he traveled all around Syria and Jordan and Egypt. And one of his main sources for discovery of manuscripts was in Cairo. So here's a map of a part of Cairo known as Old Cairo, or alternatively also called Fustat. And there was a Jewish community there for a very, very long time. And we're looking at this portion here. And in this portion of Old Cairo, there were in the Middle Ages 3 Jewish synagogues there, and the 3 synagogues practiced their version of Judaism based on where the people had originally derived from. So there was a Babylonian Jewish community and a Babylonian synagogue. There was a Palestinian, i.e., from the land of Israel, Jewish community and their synagogue. And there was a Karaite synagogue. So 3 synagogues, all active in that area from around the 10th century through to about the 14th century. In the 1300s, the Jewish community moved up out of Old Cairo and start to live in Cairo proper. But while they were here, they were a very active and important community. They were in a position, kind of in a central position for any Jewish traders and merchants coming through from other parts of the Mediterranean and going across doing trade with the Middle East. So a lot of visitors to this area, a very important place. And one synagogue in particular stood there for a very long time indeed. And this synagogue is known as the Ben Ezra Synagogue. It was established in the 10th century. It was destroyed and then rebuilt, but it managed to survive. Oh no, I've done it again. I'm sorry. There you go. Through the centuries, right through. It's still standing today. And here you can see, this is an image of the Ben Ezra Synagogue as it looked in the 19th century. And this was a recent restoration in the 2000s. And up here, around this point here, the upstairs is the women's gallery. This is an Orthodox synagogue, so the women stand upstairs. And back here was a hidden room. And this is where their Geniza was, and this is where they placed their manuscripts, in that hidden room. Now, the story as it's been traditionally told, I'm going to tell you the traditional story, and then I'll tell you where I come into this story. My research comes into this story. But the traditional story is that there were 1 or 2 people who encountered this Ben Ezra synagogue's Geniza. One of them was Samuel Furkovich, who was our manuscript hunter, but he didn't take anything away from it. They think that he ran out of funds by that point. But there were others who followed after him who did take a few things from this Geniza. But their story is not often told, and it doesn't seem like we know much about what they took. But something happened in 1896, in the spring of 1896. There were two women travelers. They were twins. Their names were Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. They were both scholars. Agnes Lewis was a scholar of the language called Syriac, and Margaret Gibson was a scholar of Arabic. They were self-taught. They grew up, their mother died very early on, and their father used to take them on many travels around the world. But he told them, I will not take you to a particular country until you learn its language first. So they were very, very well schooled in languages and fascinated by them. And for many years, they'd been fascinated by going to visit St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. They were fascinated because they'd heard that there were many ancient manuscripts being held in this monastery. And in fact, a major discovery had already happened there by a Russian manuscript hunter called Konstantin Tischendorf. And he discovered something there called the Sinaiticus manuscript, which was an ancient version of the New Testament. So, and that was it's 5th century. That was a major discovery. I mean, I'm talking here largely about the Hebrew Bible, but Christian scholars interested in the history of the New Testament were also struggling to find old texts for their studies. So Tischendorf's discovery of this major manuscript in the St. Catherine's Monastery was big, big news. So the two twin sisters, they were keen to go and visit there too. And Agnes's Syriac held her in good stead because she was able to talk to the monks. And the monks really took to her and invited them both to visit in these special rooms where they kept manuscripts hidden. And Agnes Lewis made a major discovery of a manuscript known as the Sinai palimpsest. And I need to explain what a palimpsest is. A palimpsest is an old manuscript that's been rubbed out and then new writing put on top of it. But if we're lucky, we can still see the old writing underneath. And Agnes Lewis was able to see that underneath this manuscript with newer writing on it, the newer writing was kind of medieval, there was a much older Syriac writing hidden underneath. And again, this was a very, very early copy of the Gospels. And so this too was an amazing discovery, major news in its day. And so they got a name for themselves, and they would go and travel regularly to discover manuscripts. Well, in the spring of 1896, they heard news that in the Cairo markets, there were manuscripts for sale, really important ones. And so even though they hadn't planned to travel that year, they went anyway. And they came back, they were living in Cambridge, England, and they came back with a sack of Hebrew manuscripts. And they showed them to a friend who was the reader in rabbinics at the University of Cambridge, and his name was Solomon Schechter. Now, this individual is very well known to Jewish people here in America because he was the founder of American conservative Judaism. But prior to coming here and founding conservative Judaism in this country, he was a scholar in Cambridge, and he was one of the first Jews to be allowed to be a scholar at Cambridge University. And for years, he had been one of these scholars in the rising discipline of Jewish studies, who was interested in looking at the linguistic development and the historical development of key Jewish texts. And one text that he was particularly interested in was the one that you see over here. And this is a fragment of the book of Ecclesiasticus. Ecclesiasticus is one of the books of the Apocrypha. Those are the texts that sit outside the canon of the Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, they're not included in the canon, but they were part of the Catholic Church's canon. Now, Ben Sira, the Ecclesiasticus was written by a man called Jesus Ben Sira, and it was written in the 300 BCE. And it's very much like the book of Proverbs. Um, his grandson in the first century translated it into Greek so that the growing population of Greek speaking Jews could understand it. Now, the Hebrew text went missing, it got lost, but the Greek text got retained. And thanks actually to the Catholic Church that incorporated it as part of their biblical texts. Solomon Schechter had been speculating for many years that there was a Hebrew original and that it could be traced through other Jewish writings. On the other side of the equation, the German Protestant scholars were saying that no, this was a late biblical text, it was late biblical Hebrew, and there was a whole battle between them as to the age and importance of this text. Anyway, it's rather complicated. But suffice it to say, the two twin scholars, in their sack of manuscripts, had brought back with them a medieval copy of the original Hebrew of Ecclesiasticus, which is there. And they took it to their friend Solomon Schechter, who was amazed to have this in his hand, the thing he'd been looking for. And so he wrote them this letter late at night to say, we need to congratulate ourselves. Well, actually, he put congratulate myself and then scrubbed it out. Ourselves, for the fragment that I have with me represents a piece of the original Hebrew of Ecclesiasticus. And it's the first time that such a thing has been found. Now, Solomon Schechter certainly has the realization that rumors and stories that he's been hearing of fragments of manuscripts coming out of Egypt, he realized now that they were important. If you can find something as momentous as this, showing that chain of transmission, then there must be other stuff in Egypt to be found that would be important. And so he organized a trip to Cairo. And he was funded by a Hebrew scholar and mathematician, the head of St. John's College in Cambridge. And he went to Cairo and he sat and drank many cups of coffee and smoked cigarettes with the chief rabbi until eventually he was allowed access to the Ben Ezra synagogue, where he espied a phenomenal pile of medieval Hebrew fragments. I can show you that. And this is him back in Cambridge, having brought all of those, well, most of them, fragments home. You can see the boxes and boxes of medieval Hebrew fragments and Arabic fragments, and in fact, many, many other languages were represented there. And he wrote an article about it in the Times newspaper, announcing his discovery. And from that point on, it became known as the Cairo Geniza. Let me see, hold on. So the Cairo Geniza mostly, therefore, ended up in Cambridge University Library because he and Charles Taylor, who had funded him, donated it to Cambridge University Library. And as it stands now, it's around 193,000 fragments. The worldwide collection is around 300,000 fragments of medieval Hebrew texts. So what were some of the great discoveries? Well, here we have the oldest biblical book of Nehemiah, and it says it was copied in the year 903 CE in Iran. So there you are, a fragment much older than had previously been known. And what was important about these later discoveries is that they underpinned that notion that the text had been faithfully transmitted through the centuries. But they also had little deviations that were really key to understanding how the text developed and how it was, and how the scholars who transmitted it across the centuries ensured that transmission through their work in carefully marking it, adding vocalization signs to it, and guides to reading. So in the Middle Ages, there was a massive effort in codifying the Hebrew Bible and ensuring its accurate reading and accurate copying. So it's thanks to that period that we have the Bible that we have today. and then we have possibly even older portions. It's hard to date unless the fragment itself says, hey, I was written in the 900s, which you do get because the scribes would write their colophons and write the date. Otherwise, you have to use sort of paleographical, that is, you have to study the handwriting, or and codicological evidence. You study how it's the paper and the parchment's created. Or you can do, of course, you can do now certain tests on the parchment to look at the age of it. So scholars are pretty convinced that this is probably 6th century. So again, a really, really old piece of the Bible. Just make sure I'm going through the next one. This is the old copy of the Mishnah, the oral law, and it's 841 CE. Whereas if you look on our table, the oldest at that point was, I think, 14th century. And so again, very, very much older pieces. Many, many pieces of these texts, again, enabling that reconstruction so that you can start to fill in that gap, that massive silent gap between the ancient times and the medieval period. This one, a fragment of the Babylonian Talmud, very early, 1145 CE, it was purchased because we've got notes on it that tell us about who purchased it and when, and a similar thing, that the oldest copy. And also palimpsests, many palimpsests in the Cairo Geniza. So we have the upper writing, which is a Hebrew liturgical text, and underneath that is a handwriting that's from the 5th or 6th century CE. So preserving some very ancient material indeed. And then there were things that were unexpected there. I told you that a Geniza essentially was for a place for storing an old Torah scroll. Well, over time, it became a place where you'd store your Torah scrolls and anything religious or sacred. So prayer books, any religious texts, any religious commentaries, they would all go into a Geniza. But what made the Cairo Geniza so special was it had everything in it. Anything that the Jewish community wrote down or anyone passing through went into this Geniza. So we have personal papers, dowries, hundreds and hundreds of women's dowries that give us important historical information about what they owned, not just what they owned, but what the market for materials was. You know, where the sort of the jewelry you could buy and the silks that you could purchase, and many fascinating details are on these. Then there were some state documents from the Islamic Fatimid government, and this is their Arabic state document, which was reused by somebody in the Jewish community. But this is a petition. It tells us he's been unlawfully detained. He's a merchant. He's been traveling. He comes back. He's put in prison. But he says, I shouldn't be put in prison. I paid my dues. And here is the record to show you. So we have a lot of those sorts of records that tell us all about Jewish travel in that period, and all of the historical backdrop of Muslim-Jewish relations, what it was like living in the Islamic Caliphate. Fascinating materials. Other historical documents, this one comes from the port city of Ashkelon in Palestine, and it's talking all about how they've been collecting the 123 dinars. Oops, stop. 123 dinars to be collected to ransom the Torah scrolls and the captives that have been taken by the Crusaders. So we'll learn a lot about the Crusaders and the Crusade in real time through these fragments. Yes. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Here's another fascinating historical document that's a little bit questionable. This one is a 10th century. It's a letter of introduction. This Jacob ben Chanukah is traveling to non-Jewish communities to raise funds for his prison debts. The Jewish community had already raised a portion for him, and now he's going out. But it's interesting because it has in Hebrew the word ki'ov, which scholars have suggested it's Kiev, and may provide evidence that there was a Jewish community in the Ukraine in the Middle Ages. The signatories, who are all here, they have non-Semitic names. They actually have Khazarian names, and it's been endorsed in Turkic runes. So all of this is suggestive, well, not suggestive, but maybe evidence of a long-standing story that the Khazarians in the Ukraine first converted to Judaism. And that's a whole other story. But then there are scholars who are, they say they're not sure about this. There's a big debate about it. But at any rate, it's a fascinating document. There's even the earliest recorded music in the Cairo Geniza fragments. This was produced by a convert to Judaism, a priest. His name was Johannes of Oppido. And he brought with him the Gregorian chant that he heard from his Catholic roots. And he put the notes to Hebrew liturgical poems. And we have several of those. And we also have his diary in the Geniza. So we know all about his conversion and how he embraced Judaism. Commerce, the world's earliest checks are found in the Geniza. This is an order of payment and written in a language that was used a great deal in that time, called Judeo-Arabic. So the Jews of this land, this time, they spoke Arabic. That was their daily conversation, but they wrote it down in Hebrew letters and developed a language called Judeo-Arabic. So that's that. And then medical fragments, lots about medical practices. This is a very strange medical pharmaceutical prescription. And so you have to follow all of this and boil down all of these interesting ingredients. But even it ends with beneficial if God wills. So you've really got to help that God is also on your side. So that's that. What happened was, I told you that there were visitors to the Ben Ezra synagogue before Solomon Schechter, and there were visitors afterwards. And what ended up happening was you had a massive collection that ends up at Cambridge University Library, but you also have collections around the world of varying sizes. There's a large collection in New York, in the Jewish Theological Seminary, and a large collection in Oxford, and in London, and in Paris, and in Manchester, big collections of them. And so let me see what the next slide was. Yeah, so it's been a little bit of a challenge to scholars to work on this material, because one portion of their fragment might be where they are situated in Cambridge, but another portion of it might be in Manchester. So we're very thankful to the digital age, where we can start to reunite these two torn pieces virtually. And so that's been a lot of the work of recent years. Now, I used to work with this collection. I was the bibliographer on the collection in Cambridge University Library for 12 years. And with the advent of digitization, it was a big, ambitious plan to scan everything and get it online, so scholars around the world could benefit from this amazing collection. And as we did so, I started to get a realization that Cambridge wasn't alone, and there were other collections. And I started to ask myself, well, where did they come from, and why has nobody ever talked about them? So I started to do my own investigations into the history of the collection. And so this is a diagram that I put together to kind of show how everybody talked about the history of this collection prior to the sort of investigations I did. In the middle, you've got the Ben Ezra Synagogue, ancient synagogue in Cairo, and you've got, in the early days, you've got some public libraries in Europe getting some of these materials. Oxford Library, Berlin, Cambridge gets a few. Then Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson are on the scene. A few over in Budapest. finally, a manuscript hunter from London gets a sack full. And then finally, we get to Solomon Schechter, who gets everything, clears it out, story done. He's the great discoverer. That's how the story was told. But what everybody failed to mention in this story was the fact that in 1889, the synagogue was razed to the ground and built up anew on its foundations. And between 1889 and its rebuilding in 1892, no one spoke about what happened to the manuscripts in the Geniza during those years. That's important. And so what I've discovered on my investigations is there wasn't just Solomon Schechter and a handful of others. There were all of these Geniza scholars, collectors and dealers gaining manuscripts. And the picture actually looks more like this. Not like the one that I showed you with that more simple circle, but like this. And it wasn't just the Ben Ezra synagogue. It was also an ancient cemetery in Cairo known as the Basatine Cemetery, where manuscripts were buried. There were other synagogues in Egypt that held these materials. And this was a period in the 1880s, 1890s, when the Jewish community in Cairo was developing again and blossoming. It all starts in 1860, around the period of the American Civil War, actually. Due to the American Civil War, um, um, the Americans are no longer shipping cotton over as much as they did. So people turned to Egypt for cotton. And what happens with this massive cotton boom is you get a lot of immigration over to Egypt, a lot of people moving over there, including many Jews from around the Ottoman Empire relocate to Egypt. And as they relocate, there's a whole movement to renovate and beautify the synagogues of Cairo. So many of these ancient synagogues are brought down and built back up again. And inside them, the Genizas where the manuscripts were held, those sort of get dispersed. Some of them include the Maimonides synagogue in central Cairo, which had been there since the 14th century and was razed to the ground in the 1880s. Another one, the El Amshati synagogue, Machala El Kubra, was a massive Jewish population there, and they were active at the same time as the population in the Ben Ezra synagogue was active, and they also had an important Geniza. Basatine Jewish Cemetery, as I said, it's the world's most ancient Jewish cemetery. I'll get that right. And then also in Alexandria, Alexandria is always left out of the picture, but Alexandria similarly had a very old synagogue from the Middle Ages that was razed to the ground in the 1880s. So all of these were potential sites of discovery. I won't go through this actually because we're running out of time and I want to give you time to ask questions. But it particularly becomes important when we look at some of the fragments that are inside the collection that are rather puzzling. Example, this one. This is a piece of, it's a Latin text, and it's a Latin version of the Iliad. Now, why would this be in a Jewish synagogue in Cairo? Scholars working on it have kind of done all sorts of dances and leaps and bounds to try and explain how the Jewish community could be interested in a Latin version of the Iliad. Well, that might be the case. But if you go and actually try and trace the provenance, and you actually go back to the library records, as I have done, and you look through the library records, you will find that this particular manuscript is where is it? Fragments removed from the librarian's desk. In other words, this fragment probably got into the Cairo Geniza because it was a fragment that was being examined by the librarian of Cambridge University Library, and it accidentally got included in the collection. And then there are the provenance clues on the manuscripts themselves that people have ignored. This one, right at the top, there's a number 13. And if you do the tracing of that, and you look to see who sold it, and you look at his letters, you can find the number 13, and it tallies exactly with this manuscript. And then when you do a little bit further research and you look at some of the letters, the list created by the librarian, you can see very interestingly that this was a fragment that wasn't actually even wanted. It says not wanted on the record. So that's the sort of thing I've been doing. I've been tracing where all of these pieces have come from, the stories of the other people who collected the fragments, because it tells us more about their original state. And because it also ties into the ethics of the market. A lot, not a huge amount, but some fragments came to us in the 20th century that are described as from the Cairo Geniza. But in fact, they were bundled up with other collections of papyri, and there is actually really no evidence that they were ever in the Ben Ezra synagogue. And so we need to think about that when we're looking at this massive collection. And unfortunately, the trade in fragments continues. These were 23 that were sold through Christie's just recently. And what has tended to occur recently is that when these things come up for sale, they're automatically accorded Cairo Geniza provenance. If it's a Hebrew fragment, oh, it must be from the Cairo Geniza. Now, there's a lot of scholarship on this collection. Scholarship at Princeton, in Cambridge, in Oxford, around the world. As I said, incredibly important collection, great scholarship coming out of it. A lot of matches have been made. So a lot of the collections do match up, like that one that I showed you, where the pieces of the puzzle came together. But sometimes the fragments, they say they're from the Cairo Geniza, and there really is no evidence that they are. And then this is something that happened just last year. These were sacks of manuscripts taken out of the Basatine cemetery and sequestered by the Egyptian government. And nobody bothered to record where they were dug up from, what their state was when they were dug up. No archaeological evidence recorded. And we don't know what's there. We don't know how they match to the other fragments. And so you can see this is actually a sad and ongoing story of trying to tell this whole complex and fascinating story. If you're at all interested in it, there are 4 books I recommend. One was written by my former boss, Professor Stefan Reif. He established a Geniza research unit in Cambridge, and he tells the whole history of the Cambridge collection. This one is by Rabbi Mark Glickman. This is a fantastic book because it's a really an easy read, a nice read about the whole story. This one came out, this was the prize-winning one. This one tells the story by 2 amazing scholars living in Jerusalem. And this one, if you really want to get deep down into it, this is me. Okay, that's it. I hope I haven't bamboozled you. Do let me know if you have any questions with the
Thank
time
you
we've got
so
left.
much, Rebecca. That was wonderful. What a wonderful piece of scholarship. Just marvelous. Any questions? Rick?
Thanks so much. Actually, I've been waiting a few years for you to deliver this, and it really didn't disappoint. Thanks so much. As you probably know, I lived in Egypt from 2004 to 2007 and was close with the Jewish community and visited Ben Ezra Synagogue a few times. It's just wonderful.
Yes.
I even was asked by the Jewish community in Mahdi, the suburb of Cairo, to go through their library and try to sort through things in a way that made sense, and found some letters from expatriates. One of the issues at that time was that there was actually a conflict between the Egyptian Jewish community, which consisted of maybe a few dozen women, often married to Egyptian Muslims,
Yes.
and the expatriate Egyptian Jewish community over who really should take care of the Jewish treasures? Whether should it be the Jewish community in Egypt, the Egyptian government, or those outside? And I was wondering if that has been played out over the Cairo Geniza.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very good point, and it is a very thorny issue. And it came up with one particular collection that was discovered in the Basatine Cemetery by a Cairo Jewish man in the early 20th century. His name was Jacques Mosseri. And he went around finding manuscripts in the cemetery and also buried around the synagogue, and he put together a large private collection. And he was a huge advocate for Jewish education in Cairo, and he wanted his collection to form the basis of a Jewish museum and library. Sadly, he died very young. His collection disappeared for a few years. Finally, it's gone to Cambridge University Library on loan, where it's been preserved and digitized. But now there's kind of a little bit of a disagreement in the family about where it should go. So Jacques Mosseri thought that eventually his collection, after he and his family had to leave Egypt because of the troubles, he decided that his collection should go to the new Jewish National Library in Israel. And his sons tried to make that happen, but other members of the family didn't feel that way. And so today there's a huge debate over where this collection, this wandering collection, should go. Meanwhile, down on the ground, as you say, there's probably about 3 women who are the Jewish community of Cairo, and they are doing their best to. There's a huge and wonderful library in the Karaite synagogue, which also contains some of the rabbinite mainstream Jewish manuscripts, and they're trying very much to build that library back up. They have worked with the Egyptian government to renovate the synagogue again. It just recently underwent a renovation, and interestingly, just reopened a few months ago, a grand opening, and there were no Jews present at the opening. It was all Muslim Egyptians came to it. So that the Egyptian government are very much interested in reviving some sort of the Jewish history of their country. And they've been supportive in that sense. But then this whole discovery of those sacks of manuscripts raises that thorny issue again, because it seems that they have sequestered them and we don't know what's going to become of them. And so, yeah, it's unclear. And again, it's also thorny because on many levels, because who does this collection belong to? It was put away. It was hidden away as done with. It was supposed to be buried. And many Jewish communities in some of these places feel very strongly about the removal of these things, that somehow that will bring upon them bad luck, that you really shouldn't, because they're sacred things, they should be hidden away and given a natural death, as it were. So there's a lot of, so the fact that all these European manuscript hunters came in and helped themselves to it, for them it was discarded material that was available and that opened a world of information for us. But on the other hand, the Jewish community that owned it, for them, it had a different significance. So it's thorny all around, I would say. Does that answer the question?
Yep. Thank you. It was wonderful. And even way back when I was studying archaeology in graduate school in Israel, I went to the monastery and spent several very uncomfortable days there.
Yes.
Oh,
They did that in their 70s. They climbed up that mountain in their 70s, the 2 women.
yes, yes. But the Israeli archaeologists call it Jebi Musa because
Right, yes. Oh.
knowing that it's not biblically traceable to Mount Sinai. I am going to write you. I don't want to keep it here, but I had heard about through people and seen a quick thing about the copper scroll, not the copper scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Egyptian copper scroll that they had to virtually unwrap with the MRI and found out it was Aramaic written in in old transcript. I mean, and so I will write you and ask you if you know anything, because I'm trying to trace it and
Okay.
learn more about it.
Okay,
Thank you
a
so
little.
much.
Okay, you're very welcome.
We're kind of out of time here, I think, but I had just one practical question. For for you to do this work, are you fluent in reading the text?
Not all of them. So they're a mix. I would say that the bulk is in this Judeo-Arabic. So you really have to know Arabic,
so
and I
that-
don't.
Yeah.
And what I did for my PhD studies, I studied the liturgy, which is in Hebrew. So there are texts in Hebrew. So you can get by as a scholar using this if you only know Hebrew. But, so I know Hebrew and a little Aramaic, and so that was my focus. But to do the tracing of provenance, then you're looking really at European and American archives from the 19th century. That can involve some French and German, but largely, since the bulk of the collections ended up in England and America, then it's very often English language.
Sure. And just one other thing. Today, we have a technology to pretty precisely date
Yes,
objects.
right.
Have you used that, or has it been used to help with the provenance of some of this?
It is used in some cases, but in a very limited way, because you actually have to remove a little piece of the manuscript to be able to carbon date it.
Yeah.
And so that is only in exceptional circumstances that technique is used.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we really thank you again. This has been wonderful. Folks, next week, Ramona Caponegro will be coming to talk to us about, she's a curator of children's literature at the library. And she's been on her own following the history of something called the Caldecott Awards, which have been for 85 years, selecting one American picture book. And she's done some research on how that has evolved over time. I think it'll be very interesting. So I hope we see you then. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.